Michael Bay's Transformers series has been met with an abundance of criticism throughout the years, with people around my age who grew up with the franchise finally giving our say on the flawed but beloved rendition of the robots in disguise. With the common consensus being that the original 3 films are great, with flaws, but nowhere near worthy of the hatred received. With Age of Extinction being a divisive film within the fan base and everybody agreeing that The Last Night is abysmal. But before the franchise was pretty much killed with that said film, Michael Bay and Paramount put together a writer's room for about a month where they ended up with 14 story treatments for where the franchise could go next. However, Bay almost entirely exited the franchise following The Last Night's box office failure, which was a reported over $100 million loss for Paramount. Having plans for a Transformers cinematic universe immediately fall apart, with them now having no concrete plan for the universe and throwing anything and everything at the wall. Even the supposed G.I. Joe crossover movie isn't exactly guaranteed. But what exactly were the plans for those supposed story treatments? And would they have saved the franchise and brought it back to the financial behemoth it once was? Well, even though every exact detail of the projects weren't publicly let known from Paramount themselves, concept art and plot synopsis for a few of the pitch projects have been leaked. Because for some reason Paramount has the worst studio security I've ever seen. Like, pretty much every Transformers movie has had major leaks. Like all the concept art and story details of the original 2007 film, which led to online boycotts having Bay change some ideas and designs for the characters. Or the fact that they had to redo the end of Dark of the Moon, because the script to the final scene leaked a few months before the movie came out. But honestly, for us and the sake of YouTube entertainment, thank you Paramount. Moving on though. I believe there are 2 categories for these planned sequels. Category 1 being the repurposed ideas, and Category 2 being the completely scrapped ideas. So we'll go ahead and speedrun the concepts that inevitably got retooled into other films we now know. Cybertron Prequel. This one seemed to be a fully live-action, CG-rendered film that dealt with the origin of Cybertron itself and of course the start of the famous Autobot and Decepticon civil war. This film ended up being repurposed into the incredible Transformers 1, which is set outside of the Bay continuity and even the Bay reboot continuity that started with Bumblebee, with producer Lorenzo D. Bonaventura stating, "If we did this as a live-action movie, it would probably cost $500 million. Which, hey, being able to set it out of the original Bay continuity and make it animated gave them so much freedom to tell what I believe to be the most accurate portrayal of the Transformers and their mythos in a film since the original 1986 movie. And even though it failed at the box office and we unfortunately aren't getting a follow-up, I'm so glad we at least have this one movie to revisit for years to come. Beast Wars. There were plans for a complete Beast Wars era film that would have followed the Maximals and Predacons in their own story. That's all that's seemingly known about the project, and obviously it got repurposed into Rise of the Beast, with them incorporating the main Autobots into the storyline and setting it in the 1990s instead of prehistoric times, deciding to follow up after the events of 2018's Bumblebee. Personally, I would have loved for them to do a solo Beast Wars movie and then we get Rise of the Beast. That way we could have actually spent more time getting to know the Maximals because they kinda got sidelined in the movie. And then it would have also been more exciting because we would have been doing a proper crossover film in the franchise, leading to even more hype. But honestly, Rise of the Beast didn't do too well at the box office, so who knows what a straight up Beast Wars movie with no Optimus or Bee would have done. Transformers 5. Return of the Gods. You heard me right, Transformers 5. You see, the writers' room got together around March of 2015. 2 years prior to the release of The Last Night, which should make a lot of sense now why that film is a jumbled mess. Bay pretty much threw half the ideas spat out in the writer's room and made a hodgepodge of them into one singular movie worth of setup, which was planned to span 2 more films. But we'll get to all of that later. Return of the Gods is on paper very similar to The Last Night, following a lot of the same plot threads, but was not retconning and actively ignoring continuity of the past films. So no Bumblebee in World War II, or Drift in feudal Japan, or Ironhide on some 15th century boat. Written by Aaron Krager, it would have followed up on Optimus's travel into space to find his creators after the events of Age of Extinction, and it would have leaned heavily into that plotline, in the way The Last Knight did not, making the story 2 films essentially. As Optimus is in space, B would have taken up the role of leader for the Autobots instead of having Cade babysit them. Which, speaking of Cade, he still would have been in the movie, with the Autobots having to fight off Galvatron, who would have been the main villain, while also setting up Unicron for the 6th film. Again, something we'll talk about in a bit. Prime would have discovered the Quintessons and of course Quintessa. This version of the film would have dived into the origins of Cybertron, making it more of a main plot. It seems like Galvatron would have been most likely working with Quintessa, and the 2 storylines would have been working up to the truth about Unicron, who I don't know would have still been Earth or not. Optimus would have still become Nemesis Prime, but that would be the ending of the film, leaving it off on a cliffhanger for part 6. They also did intend to set up the King Arthur stuff in this movie and still introduce the Guardian Knights. Overall, Krager intended to make a more cohesive film than Age of Extinction, while adding more lore to Cybertron and set up an overarching story involving Unicron and the Transformers' history with Earth, while still respecting the already established canon. The BumbleBee Spin-Off. Okay, this is the perfect way to slowly make a transition to the ideas that got completely scrapped. And now I already know what you're thinking, but we did get a BumbleBee spin-off. Yes, we did, but nothing even close to what the original pitch was, thus making this one right in the middle between both categories. With the main giant change being the fact that this film was going to take place in the Victorian era, having a heavy steampunk aesthetic. It would have been an Indiana Jones style adventure following Bumblebee and 2 other human leads, one of them being this shotty right here, having the horrible working title be Bumblebee and the Island of Beasts. The concept art gives off a very clearly Skull Island inspired location, where they would have met Beast Wars characters who most likely landed in this remote island during the prehistoric era and were stuck there due to the isolation of the island. With the main villain being Onyx Prime, who is one of the first 13 Cybertronians created from Primus, giving them all the first titles of Prime. Onyx was an exceptionally unique Prime, being the first one to have the ability to change into Beast, connecting the character heavily, of course, to Beast Wars. From there, I could guess that he is the leader of this island, and they do a whole Sentinel Prime twist where you think he's a swell guy until he isn't. This whole idea ended up sparking spin-offs from this as well, following different characters set during this era, making this a fat Transformers what if. Honestly, really glad this didn't go through. It sounds like it would have been horrible in my opinion. Alright, before moving on completely now to the scrapped ideas, we have the honorable mention of a G.I. Joe crossover, which has been in development hell since the beginning of time and isn't exactly a shock that they threw the idea around again in the writer's room. Okay, now to the fully scrapped ideas. Operation Skyfire. This was going to be a World War II set film where the Nazis find Megatron frozen in the ice and bring him out of his coma to fight along with them. Somehow, there also would have been Decepticons, and they would have been, drumroll please, Nazi Decepticons. It seems like a group of American pilots end up finding the Autobot known as Skyfire, a character that was supposed to be introduced in The Last Knight but got scrapped, on an island in a banged up state. They help fix him up, and then he becomes their friend and ally, helping them fight Megatron and the Nazis. B would have also been a major character in the film, with the tone and narrative also being another heavily Indiana Jones inspired story. Transformers 6 and 7. These 2 films were officially announced in 2016 by Paramount and would have been the proper follow-up to The Last Knight. The last film would have been titled Transformers: The End of Time, making it a culmination film, having the series come to a proper conclusion and tie together all the spin-offs and different era films. And to truly understand these last 2 films, you have to understand what the supposed plan was all along, if you haven't figured it out already. Simply put, Bay had an idea for a saga starting in The Last Knight, to tie humanity's history to the Transformers, and all these spin-off movies would essentially be showing this said history all coming together by End of Time, which would have not only been their big endgame, but also their flashpoint. From all the information I've gathered, even though it hasn't been said, I 100% believe it would have been one story that was split into a two-part film. With the first part being Quintessa trying to kill Unicron, which is actually a really interesting idea. Because obviously Unicron is evil, but you know, he's Earth as well, so we don't exactly want that. And the fact that he's Earth makes sense on why Transformers have been coming to this world the whole time, because they're attracted to Unicron's energon. Does it make sense for the continuity pre The Last Knight? No, not at all. Anyways, Unicron would have created his own avatars, and Megatron would have been leading them on an assault against Quintessa, the Autobots, and Earth, with Cade Yeager making one more return. It seems like they would have defeated Unicron, and Quintessa and Megatron would have taken over the Earth. And speaking of the Earth, it was left in such a bad shape that the world is in a post-apocalyptic state. That plotline picks up in the now next film, End of Time, set in the future with the Terminator or Days of Future Past setting. The humans have been at war with the Cybertronians for a few centuries, and Optimus Prime would have died. Again. With descendants of Cade Yeager creating some sort of uprising against Megatron and the rest of the Decepticons after they, of course, resurrect Optimus. The story was going to have time travel and heavily involve King Arthur and the Round Table, while also going to other times in history, showing the Transformers' influence in Greek, Egyptian, and Norse cultures, while having some kind of plotline with a sun harvester hidden beneath Olympus. The main villains would have been Liege, Maximo, and the Primes. Liege is actually one of the original 13 Primes created by Primus, which of course is a connection to the BumbleBee spin-off. They called Maximo the Prime of Lies, and he is a sort of Loki-esque character. My theory is that these primes, followed by Maximo, would be following the protagonist throughout history to put a stop to them changing the timeline for some reason. However, in conclusion, the film would end up with a timeline reset, ending the base saga completely and allowing the series to start from fresh. And with that lies all that I could find about the infamous Transformers writers' room. Personally, I think some of the projects seemed interesting, like Operation Skyfire and Return of the Gods. I even enjoyed the idea of a time-traveling Transformers movie. But I think most of these ideas would have been a mess, and the conflict of the continuity would have been horrendous to follow along with. I also love the dense lore that Transformers has, pretty much all thanks to the comics. But these movies never seemed to be able to tell it right, and always skipped over it, with The Last Knight being the biggest example of that. They were simply ideas, but nothing the series or that film specifically wanted to follow through with. Am I happy with the current direction of Transformers films? I could take it or leave it. As long as they continue telling great stories, that's all I care about. But as someone who has never cared about G.I. Joe, I don't care about a crossover film, and I do wish to see some other type of overarching story within the franchise that actually dives into Cybertron's history, and go all crazy with it the way they did with Transformers 1, which now makes me even more sad that the movie isn't getting a sequel. But with that said, I'll take the last 3 films we've gotten in the series over whatever the hell they were originally planning. Especially since I really like those last 3 movies. I just wish it was all put together in a neater package in terms of continuity, if that makes sense. Anyways, if you love Transformers, why not check out my retrospective look on all of Bay's entries into the franchise, down here on the left. If you're a more classic Transformers fan, that's cool too, because I also did a retrospective on Skybound and Daniel Warren Johnson's comic series, down here on the right. Thanks for checking out the video, and may Transformers have a bright future.